Chapter 7 deals with legal, ethical, and interestingly enough, tagged on at the end, tax issues. So there's a lot of good, useful information in this chapter. Make sure you've read through it all, talking about tort and what's a contract and all those, jurisdiction, who has control. A lot of useful information. I'm just going to focus on a few things I think are especially important. So the bottom line is, when we're dealing with e-commerce, we have to abide by the same laws, regulations that a brick and mortar store does. Things like, false advertising, the contractual relationship we have with a customer when they provide us money and we're agreeing to provide goods or services. But there are some additional complicating factors that come into play. One of them is international. Now, each state may have its own regulations, but each country has their own regulations as to what you can and cannot do in e-commerce and what you're expected to do. Usually this is handled by treaties that are negotiated between the United States and other countries, but you need to understand what those treaties entail and how that impacts your particular business. One interesting thing, as the author points out, is that even a company that does not exist, isn't based in the U.S. can be sued in the U.S. courts, and I would say likewise, a U.S.-based company can be sued in courts outside of the U.S. And the most notable example is Facebook has gotten in trouble with the European Union and been sued over there for not following European privacy laws. One concept that I think is important here is that a lot of times, even if we don't have a specific treaty with a country, we will tend to go and enforce that country's laws. We want our businesses adhering to that, as a way of developing friendly relationships, maintaining them with other countries. And so that's the concept of comity. No, it's not comedy, but I like the in the parentheses there, it's just really being friendly and nice. But the big problem we have in e-commerce is the legislation, the laws, the rules, the norms are changing very rapidly. In an online business, they're constantly changing. This is much more an issue with e-commerce than traditional brick and mortar stores. And then we have the issue of conflict of laws. We have laws on the federal, state, local laws, not to mention international, and they are often at times not exactly in sync with each other. And so they may address a similar issue but coming at different perspectives, and so you as a business trying to figure out, what do you need to do? Even if you're a small startup company, it's important that you have legal counsel that you can consult with, and to understand this is a very complex thing. So even as a startup, there's two professional services at a minimum you need to establish a relationship with. One is a CPA to make sure you're doing your accounting correctly, so you don't get in problems with the IRS for the way that you're accounting for your revenue and taxes. And the second is you need to have a lawyer that you can consult with as needed. Let's see. So the example here, I think, is very appropriate since we live in Portland. We have a lot of wineries in the area. There is no universal ruling on whether or not you can ship wine out of Oregon to another state, another city, another county, and under what circumstances. Now, because this is interstate commerce, you would think that the federal government would have stepped in and said, here's what you can and cannot do. Unfortunately, the federal government has done very little to address the issues raised by e-commerce, And so we're stuck with laws that really were written around brick and mortar stores and don't take into consideration the span that e-commerce has. Now, one of the assignments you're going to be working on deals with copyright and also deals with underage children on the internet. So just as a reminder, copyright is a right that a government gives you as the creator of some piece of work. It can be a picture, music, a book, an article, any number of things that qualify under that. And you, as the author of that, get to decide how it gets used. And usually there's a specific length of time, doesn't last forever. Interesting thing happened, and I actually, it was not too long ago that I became aware of this, that there had been a change in the copyright law to where you do not have to actually register your music, your written material, or anything else to have it protected by copyright law. After 1989, which was a long time ago, you get automatic copyright protection when you create it. All you have to do is to be able to show when you created it, and you were the first one that created it, and then you have copyright protection. So that applies to web pages. Although you will see, like at the bottom of this slide, there's copyright 2017 Cengage Learning, may not be scanned, copied, or duplicated, except for use as permitted. That's actually a duplication. It's not technically required. That comes automatically. When the Cengage created this set of PowerPoint slides, those rights and restrictions were automatically attributed to this piece of work. Now we do have a little bit, and you notice at the bottom there is, as long as it's a password protected website or school approved learning management system for classroom use, which of course applies to us, then we can do a lot of things. And so it doesn't really apply in our situation. And there's a whole thing called fair use that describes when you can use something that's copyrighted without getting permission first. I choose to err on the side of contacting the original source and telling them what I intend to use it for. But in education, you pretty much have a blank check. You can do a lot of things if it's in an educational environment. When you get to commercial enterprise, though, then you have the restrictions to where you do have to get permission. And fair use of a copyrighted work for a for-profit business, you basically don't qualify for fair use. And this is an example of a statement you might see, and you notice some of the exceptions they list for criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, research. They're saying that's not an infringement of copyright. So some of the things already mentioned, educational uses. Usually you'll be, if there's ever a question, because it's educational, they will say, no, that's fine. They may consider different standards when it comes to music. And if there's very small sections that have been used, you may be able to get a fair use exception. And of course, the court will consider what the impact of your use is. You know, did you materially damage the copyright holder by what you did? Of course, bottom line is, who wants to go to court? So when in doubt, ask for permission, and if you don't get it, don't use it. Find some other way of accomplishing what you do. There's a lot of information out on the internet on how to determine fair use and how you can know what you can and cannot use. For example, the University of Texas has a course on that. But copyright law is very complex, so like I say, if you aren't able to get a clear answer, you're not sure, that's when you need to go to your attorney and say, here's the situation, what do they recommend? Let's see, the internet's made things worse because information is available and someone may post something without giving attribution to the original author, so you may not know where it came from and who to contact in order to get permission to use it. And this one, if you're not familiar with Napster, they were a music sharing service. All they did is they allowed people to post music on their website to share with others. Where Napster got in trouble is that they didn't monitor and make sure that the material being posted was either public domain, where there was no copyright, or that the copyright holder had granted permission to post it. Because certainly as a copyright holder, as the creator of the content, I can say, hey, anyone can do anything they want to with my work, that's fine, you know, more power to them. But Napster got in trouble because they didn't monitor what was being done, and in fact there was a lot of illegal sharing of music where the copyright holder had not given permission, and it was deriving those artists of revenue from the sale of their work. A lot of times you will see, and especially this is true with software, where the copyright holder, the manufacturer, the musician, the author, will indicate specifically how many copies, when you purchase something in a digital format, you know, how many copies can you make? Sometimes you'll see something that says you may make one copy for backup purposes only, or you can install it on one computer and one computer only. I have a piece of software that says I can install it on one computer and I can never transfer that to another computer. So when my old laptop died, they would not allow me to transfer that copy to a new laptop. They said I had to buy a new copy of the software. So the point is, you have to understand what each copyright holder has identified as the, you know, what they are granting you when you purchase that product. Of course, we've all seen digital watermarks. This is used a lot with software where you want to try out the software before you buy it. And so the publisher will make a version available that maybe only have some of the features, or it may be a full featured, but they've got digital watermarks embedded in it. So anytime you try and save it, print it, you know, the output will have the watermark across it, so it's obvious, you know, and it would be unusable to you in a commercial setting unless you purchase it, so you can remove the watermark. Copy control, you can limit the number of copies that you can make. And so now moving on to advertising. The FTC, just like with brick and mortar magazines and everything else, regulates advertising, and in particular will investigate when someone is concerned that there's been some false advertising, you know, there have been some claims made. So advertising claims that mislead substantial number of consumers in a material way, that is illegal in the US, just like in traditional. You have to be upfront and honest with what you're saying, and more importantly, you have to be able to back up what you're saying with the basis of legitimate, you know, support documentation. It can't be made up fake documents. You have to be able to show clinical trials, you know, engineering measurements. You have to have something to support the claims that you're made. Oftentimes, the Better Business Bureau will report to the FTC and say, we're getting a lot of complaints on this particular organization. The FTC may then choose to investigate. So specific things that you need to avoid: bait advertising, consumer lending and leasing. There's a whole bunch of regulations around that. Endorsements. If you're going to have a celebrity endorsement or a testimonial, there's specific policies on that with the FTC as to what you need to do, what are best practices, guarantees and warranties. If you're going to publish pricing, one of the things I get is 50% off. 50% off of what? The normal price or the inflated price? There's all kinds of regulations on that. And not just the FTC, also the FDA, BATF, and DOT. Those are agencies that get involved with depending upon the industry that you're in. So the problem we have with jurisdiction is that web crimes by nature are not limited to a geographic location. So if someone robs a bank, they robbed a bank in a specific city physically, it's pretty obvious, okay, who has jurisdiction? The local police department, the state courts. But web crimes can be initiated from anywhere in the world against anywhere in the world. And so who has jurisdiction over that person that perpetrated that crime? And the one that's mentioned there, commandeering computers to attack other computers, that's called a DDoS attack, which stands for Distributor Denial of Service attack. I go into great detail on that in BA131 as to how that works and the problem that presents to business. Prosecuting across international boundaries, I would change that last word, difficult, to virtually impossible. One of the problems with cybercrime is that virtually no one ever gets prosecuted, convicted, and punished. It just doesn't happen. It's one of those cases where if you want to go into crime with essentially 0% chance of ending up in jail or getting a fine levied against you, go into cybercrime. It is very hard to do that. Let's see. Okay, new types of crime. As I mentioned earlier, the federal government has been incredibly slow to address the changes that have happened in our society and how we do business. Most of our laws really apply to pre-internet times, and so they just don't address this whole concept of cybercrime. Cyberbullying is an example. Cyberbullying is a big deal. Just because it's done via the internet instead of being standing face to face with the individual in person, it still is, a very damaging event, and it is illegal. And we need to really, as a society, address the cyberbullying, because again, like with other cybercrime, people have been getting away with far too much of that. To that extent, some states are starting to take up and say, if the federal government isn't going to step in, we will pass laws that address this. This is another interesting one. If I can hack into my competitor's computer system, I can steal data about the products they're making. Maybe there's a trade secret. I could look at their sales projections, what their new product launch is going to be, what their pricing strategies are, and that is clearly just, I am breaking and entering, just as if I was busting down the front door of their office. And there have been a number of cases, if you may recall, Sony Pictures, where some individuals, we believe it was the North Korean government, hacked into their system and said, we will publish all these embarrassing emails that they were able to retrieve from Sony if they went ahead and released the movie that was kind of a parody and making fun of the premier of North Korea. And so that's a form of criminal extortion. They were blackmailing them, saying, if you go ahead with your plans, we will do this bad thing and release all this. This is an interesting one, that when you have physical goods that are stolen, how do the people that stole them get any money for them? Well, it used to be that you'd go down to the local fence and your local fence would offer you so much money for it, and then they'd kind of sell it, out of the backs of trucks and other things. But now with eBay and Craigslist, we sell the stuff. We can just go ahead and post it on eBay and Craigslist. Company I worked for, we actually had, we noticed with inventory that a number of our finished goods items, which were not inexpensive items, they were, maybe $1,000, $1,500, and we were short a bunch of those. And when we looked on Craigslist, lo and behold, we saw those same items being sold, as brand new, listed on Craigslist. We let the Portland Police Department know about it, and they did a sting operation. And it turns out the person that had listed them on Craigslist worked in our warehouse and had been sneaking them out of the warehouse, putting them in the dumpster, and then coming in on evenings or weekends and retrieving them from the dumpster. So you can catch the bad guys by monitoring eBay and Craigslist. This other one too, sometimes the criminals are not really bright and they will post on social networking, wow, that worked really great. That scam, I walked away with $10,000 and I'm down at Cabazon, San Lucas, staying at Hotel XYZ, drinking, a fruity beverage and just relaxing in my ill-gotten gains. And the police monitoring it say, oh, that's where they are. Let's send them down and arrest them. And that's happened a number of times. It's going brilliant. You don't make a post like that. But anyhow. But I want to touch briefly. I go into this a lot more in depth in BA131. In e-commerce, we also have to be aware of this idea that these different ways of cybercrime, denial of service attacks, and other things really constitute a new form of terrorism. And it can be really escalated to the point of being considered a warfare using a completely digital weapon and attack. It's really quite scary when you look at it, that with the cyber warfare tools that are out there, that you could potentially allow a nuclear reactor to have the pressure rise to the point where it explodes and you end up with something like the Chernobyl event that occurred. Now, Chernobyl, it was an operator error that resulted in that, but the effects would be similar, just devastation. We're going to see, unfortunately, more and more of that. This is just the it's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of websites that are being operated by hate groups and terrorist organizations. They post instructions how to create biological weapons. They're helping recruit new members. Training films. All this is available on the internet. And even though the U.S. Department, Homeland Security, Interpol, and other organizations are developing considerable resources to try and combat this, the problem is that with the mobility of the internet, you can have a website that's located in Moscow today, and tomorrow it's located in Czechoslovakia, and the next day, because you just pack up your laptop, hop on the train, hop on a plane, and move to the next city. So it's very difficult to keep, track of these individuals and to try and shut down. They keep moving their websites, keep moving the domain names that they're, where they're hosted. It's a problem. So just a couple of ethical issues. We do need to follow the same ethical standards that we would expect other brick and mortar stores to follow. If you don't, you can really hurt your reputation. So things like customer returns, customer service, everything we expect from a brick and mortar store, you have to provide that same level of service to your e-commerce customers. Truth in advertising. You need to make true statements. You don't want to include misleading statements. You don't want to omit pertinent data, just like with a brick and mortar store. You have to be honest and upfront. Your promotions have to be reasonable. You can't make outrageous claims that are not true or not that you can't back up and substantiate with research. Product comparisons. In my career in business, I chose never to tackle my competition head to head. I never did anything like, say our product lasts 30% longer than company XYZ. Now, I would say that compared to other leading brands in this particular industry, our product has been shown to last 30% longer, but I never named names. I just think it's better off not to do that. But bottom line, if I'm going to make that statement, I need to show, where did I get that 30% number from? How did I arrive at that? I have to be able to substantiate that. Privacy rights. Online privacy is an issue. As we saw in 2018, Facebook has been in a lot of trouble globally for not protecting our personal information as well as people think they should have. And in particular, the European Union has really come down hard on them. We do have laws in the US, though, that set some guidelines on that. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, the law was written in 1986. That's really before the internet took off, and it really dealt with just phone conversations on the privacy. It needs to be updated, obviously. Unfortunately, there have been a few attempts to update that privacy for online, but they've all been challenged on constitutional as to violating a person's free speech and other things, and so they haven't figured out yet how to update the law in a way that will stand up to a constitutional challenge. I like this. In 1999, the FTC said, we don't need any laws about privacy. That would be wrong. They certainly got that one wrong. The Direct Marketing Association, this is a good group to participate in, be a part of it. They have a set of privacy standards that they recommend their members adhere to. Some of the significant issues in online privacy, as I've mentioned several times during this talk, the laws have not kept pace. The nature and degree of personal information has really increased, and it threatens people's privacy rights. The amount of information that can be tracked by Google and Yahoo and others with our web site visits is really pretty astounding. You'd be surprised at what they can infer from what sites you go to, how long you stay on the sites, what you do at the site. And certainly the security breaches have just, it seems like there isn't a week go by that there isn't an announcement of someone else that has been hacked into, and all that information becomes potentially available to the criminals. I have twice now been the victim of identity theft. Fortunately, it didn't impact me directly, other than it took time for me to deal with it, to go down, file the police report, to verify that they hadn't gotten any of my funds, and so forth. A bit of a pain, but other people have had their lives really disrupted majorly because of identity theft. The challenge we have with e-commerce is that we're not dealing with the United States. Really, any business of any size very quickly is doing business potentially globally. And there are differences culturally around the world as to what level of privacy is expected. And that's one of the ways I think Facebook really got in trouble with the European Union. Facebook was marginally questionable in the US with their handling. You could argue it kind of both ways as to whether they were doing due diligence or not. Probably most people leaning towards no, they weren't. But in Europe, it was flat out they failed. They violated European law, black and white, no questions. So different areas around the world have different expectations. The big issue we've had to deal with in the US is this opt-in versus opt-out concept. Opt-out means I can send spam, which by definition is something that I did not ask to receive. I can send it to anybody. If I find out what your email address is by buying the list from someone else, by doing a scan on the internet, I find a valid email for you, I can send you whatever I want to. And then, of course, I have to give you the option to say, don't do that anymore, so I can opt out of it, but I can flood your inbox with spam until you tell me to stop. A much better approach is to say, I'm not going to send anything to anyone unless they ask for it. And the best way is what's called a double opt-in, and that's where you request to be added to a list, and then the particular company or service will send you a confirming email saying, this is just to confirm that you do in fact want to receive this. Please click here to confirm. So I've had to both initiate the initial request and then confirm the request. That's why it's called double. That's the best way to do it. So really, when it comes to, you want to have the reputation of a company that values people's privacy. So you really should take the conservative approach. You use the data collected only to benefit how you interact with customers. Have a stated privacy policy. It says that you will not sell their information. You will not provide their information to interested third-party organizations. That you will only use it for your own company's use. That is the best policy to go with. Yes, you can make money by selling that information. And that is not illegal to sell people's information if you've said up front that you're going to do that. It's not illegal to provide it to third-party companies that are similar. So a bank might provide your information to an insurance company because anyone that's doing banking may need insurance. That's not illegal. You need to be upfront and state that you're going to do it, and I would strongly urge you, encourage you, just don't do it. That's not a way to generate revenue. It's not the right way to do it. Keep that information for your use only. And this bullet, I like this, that you really should provide customers a way of saying, it was interesting getting stuff from you, but I don't want to have a relationship with your company anymore. So please remove me from your database, purge all information about me. You really should give your customers have an easy way that they can do that. And it shouldn't be buried and hidden, in some obscure menu. Make it obvious and easy. And this last one, you need to train your employees how to keep customer data secure and safe so that people can trust your organization. Bottom line, you want to build trust. Now, communications with children opens up a whole new consideration. When a child is less than 13, there's specific laws that you have to adhere to because children are recognized that they do not have the same skill level and thought process to understand the risks of sharing information and what they're doing. So we have to take different steps when it's a child that's on your site. And I like this, that in most countries, you are not considered an adult until you're 21. So that age group, the 18 to 21, where in the US you might be tempted to consider them as adults, it's really better to set the level at 21 so that you're consistent around the world. And as I mentioned before, that age of 12 or 13 is where, in most countries, specific laws kick in about what you can and cannot do with a young visitor to your website. There are some federal laws that have been passed in this area. 1998, COPA, and then also in 1998, COPA with two P's. They couldn't come up with different names. Yes, that's not a misspelling. Those are two separate acts. The one deals with restricted access. The other act does not regulate content, but it deals with other areas. And then 2001, we have a similar SIPA, and this required federally funded schools to install filtering to prevent children from seeing sites that are deemed inappropriate for their age level. And companies that have websites that appeal to children have to be really careful that you're adhering to the laws that are on the books, the federal laws, with how you interact with that. So here's an example. This is from a company, as you see, they're based in Hong Kong. And they're saying that for children under the age of 13, they do not collect personal information. And the way they're going to make sure that they're not gathering personal information is they're going to ask, when you sign into their website, what was your month, year, and date, of your birth, so they can determine if you're under 13 years of age. Of course, the problem with that is that I can lie. When I come to that site, if I'm 12 years old, I just put in, a date that's 5 years older, so I look like I'm 17, or I make it look like I'm 24. There's no real way to determine that the person typing on that keyboard is actually the age that they say they are. And that's an issue. So while the intent is great, it is not preventing underage children from seeing content that they should not see. You do have to post clear and comprehensive online privacy policies. In particular, you have to give notice to the parents about needing to provide parental consent for their child. You do, as the parent, have the choice of allowing data collection. And again, you as the parent determine if you want to have it deleted, prevent further data collection. That's the way it's supposed to work. But again, it's assuming that we know the age of that person typing on the keyboard. Okay, password for the quiz. This week it's copyright. And that will allow you to take the Chapter 7 quiz. And remember, once you take that quiz, then you will have access to the other assignments for this week. If you need to, go ahead and pause this video, grab a piece of paper and a pencil or whatever, however you choose to get it. But password, copyright. Okay, lastly, let's talk a little bit about taxation. The challenge we have with web businesses is that we span across the entire country and potentially the entire world. And so with a brick and mortar store, you know exactly what taxes you have to pay. You've got to pay if there's a city income tax or a county tax, state tax. You know for that brick and mortar store who you're paying and what the rates are. But now all of a sudden, I have to deal with not just my city and state, but all 50 states, several thousand counties, multiple thousand cities, all who may have different tax rates. Very complex. And so we've got all these different taxation authorities around the country, and I have to keep track of all of that. Again, this impacts the ability to do business across state lines, which is interstate commerce. And the federal government is in particular, chartered with, monitoring, maintaining, promoting interstate commerce. And the FTC and other organizations in Congress have been very slow to do anything to address this. Amazon has taken it upon themselves to start gathering those taxes and keeping track of it. They're big enough, they have the computer horsepower that they can keep track of all these different taxing municipalities. But for a small business owner, this can present a real challenge for you in doing e-commerce. The federal government really needs to step up to the plate and do their job for a change. Another concept mentioned briefly is this idea of value-added tax. Now, in the United States, we don't have that, although people have talked about adding it as a way of generating more tax revenue. In the United States, we only put tax on the transaction that occurs at the very end, when the finished product or service is delivered to the consumer. That's when tax is required. In Europe, at each stage in the process, so I start with some iron ore that I run through my smelter and I process it down to bar steel, and I sell that bar of steel to a manufacturer. I added value. I converted that raw iron ore into something more usable. Therefore, I have to pay a tax when I sell that to the next person in the chain. So now I have a machinist that takes that bar of steel and they bend it into a specific shape for the frame of a bicycle, and they sell it to a bicycle manufacturer. I have converted that bar of steel into something more useful, and so I have to pay tax on that transaction. And so you can see it starts adding up, and why Europe and other people have adopted it is they see it as a way of generating more tax revenue. So far, the U.S. has not implemented that. It's been shot down when it's been brought up. I hope that continues to be the case, because that just adds another layer of complexity that you have to keep track of. And as shown here, the EU does have some rules, like down here, non-EU sellers have to collect the VAT rate in the buyer's country. It's always determined by where the product ends up, the end user, the consumer. And again, if you're a small company, you need to be working with a CPA and an attorney to understand what do you need to be doing to handle those international sales that you make. Or you can do like I did with my online business. My online business was hosted through Amazon, and Amazon took care of all that tracking, information for me. They handled all that. I didn't actually have to do any of that supplemental. And there you have it. That's Chapter 7.